internet infrastructure. My name is Jochai Ben-Avie. I am the co-founder and CEO of Connect Humanity. We are a nonprofit fund accelerating digital equity and provide underserved communities with the access to capital and knowledge they need to build their own infrastructure and take control of their digital futures. I also want to thank our partners at the Internet Society, the Association for Progressive Communications, and Connectivity Capital, who made this report happen. And to the folks out there who are on the front lines, connecting unconnected communities, providing reliable, affordable internet, and particularly thrilled to have Chris and Bruce and Shaun with us today to share more about their work, which features in this report. One bit of housekeeping before we dive in. Please use the Q&A tool in your webinar application to ask questions of the panelists, and we will get to those toward the end of today's session. In 2020, the pandemic, I think, really moved digital equity up the agenda and galvanized efforts to close the digital divide. This is something the authors of this report and the supporters of this report have been working on for some time, but I think the pandemic really brought this to the fore in a new way. And while money is clearly critical, I think many of us felt that there was not enough discussion about not just how we need more money to be directed toward this problem, but how we need to use that money differently. After all, depending on whose numbers you believe, a third to a half of humanity is currently unconnected to the internet. And the second half of humanity will not be connected in the same way as the first, which is to say largely by large incumbent telecommunications companies. While these firms have connected billions of people, they're meeting their limits. It is simply not in their business model to invest in low-income communities, often rural and remote communities, that make up the majority of those still offline today. Connecting these communities demands that we do things differently, and we commissioned this report to help change that conversation. At Connect Humanity, we believe that these incumbent operators have not and will not solve this problem, which is why we focus on investing in community connectivity providers. The group of community networks, municipal networks, social enterprises, cooperatives, who are continuously proving themselves to be sustainable and getting the job done where others have left these communities behind or have redlined them. And this report provides guidance not only on the range of sort of owner-operator models of what a community connectivity provider can look like, but also on innovative financing solutions. Because after all, while community connectivity providers are getting the job done in community after community around the world, many struggle with access to capital. And our goal with this report is to help catalyze funding for these internet providers that can connect all communities so that everyone has the connectivity they need to participate in our digitalizing world. So I'm really excited to dive in. I'm going to hand over now to Ben Matranga from Connectivity Capital, which led on the report, to give an overview of what's inside. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jochai. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you. We know several folks around the world are on the call. I know I got a ping this morning on WhatsApp from Brian in Malawi, who's on as well. So it is truly an international gathering. So thank you all for joining us. My name is Ben Matranga. I'm managing partner at Connectivity Capital. And alongside my co-founder, Jim Forrester, we're excited to be here. This has been an ongoing journey for us. And frankly, we're still in the first inning. Our goal as sector-specific impact investors has always been twofold. First, it's to be investors, to place capital in last mile connectivity providers, in CCPs, but more importantly, to create the category of connectivity as impact investors. We believe that it is distinct, it is new, and part of that effort is broadening the tent and really seeing just the spectrum of options out there. One of the joys that we found in writing this report is getting to go deep on a Muni network in Idaho, getting to look at an amazing rollout of operations in South Africa. All of these operations have a lot of similarities. And when you get to pick those apart, there's a lot of power in learning from that and be able to scale up. So in terms of kind of how the report comes together, our goal has really been to demystify. We hope as you read it, you nod your head a lot. You look at the material and you say, wow, that seems obvious. Because at the end of the day, the model of running a CCP is actually quite simple. There's only a few dials that you can turn. You're essentially buying wholesale, selling retail. That sounds simple, but it's not easy. And that journey of doing that takes on many forms given different environmental factors, given the operating environment that you're in. So we hope that you could take that material and be able to put it into work. Now, we want to thank our partners at APC, Internet Society and Connect Humanity. For the longest time, we had been consumers of their products for many years. Certainly all of the amazing work that those organizations have done around governance, around technical training, around ecosystem development, around internet exchange points, peering, the importance of peering. This is, we often say financing is about the fourth act in a play. And all of that previous work is out there. It's amazing. We hope everyone kind of consumes it and gets a lot out of it. What we try to do in this report is explain some of those other acts of the play, simplify them, and understand how that then contributes to financing. Financing really is dependent upon the choice of owner-operator structure, what you can do in terms of bending the cost curve and how you operate, and being able to optimize for the end point that you want for your clients. So with that, we'll jump into the initial slide in the report. And the first thing I think is critical for us is target audiences. Certainly there is something for operators themselves, for investors, and also for government and policymakers. We want operators to be able to speak a common language to reduce that friction. Frankly, the term that we always use is we want operators to play offense. We want them to feel empowered by how their network works, by the not only the rhetoric that funding sources use, but why they care about certain things. What is financial sustainability? What does it mean to be cash flow positive? It's not only kind of an accounting term, right, that your cash inflows are greater than your outflows, but it's also a way of how you seek to grow the network, right? What are your retained earnings to keep contributing to the network? How does that contribute to the CapEx over time? So we hope some of this gives them the offense to it. On the investor side, a lot of that is about what should you focus on? It will change in different stages of the life cycle of a different entity. And we hope that when investors look at CCPs, they can identify what stage of the operation they're in, what set of tools are the predominant funding tools, and they can get to a place where they're actually looking to transact on a much faster basis. And then lastly, for government policymakers, is a broad way of looking at this sector and the understanding that all of those inputs, your cost of backhaul, being able to source the equipment that you need, et cetera, all play a tremendously important role in being able to operate. With that, let me pass it over to my colleague and the primary author, Anoop and Jochai, who will take it from here.
Thank you, Ben. Welcome, everyone. My name is Anoop Nagendra. I worked closely with amazing authors and just operators to make this content come alive. And what we're trying to do today is recap some of the major report highlights. We're going to start with actually what are CCPs. Jochai provided a broad definition, and it is deliberately broad and big tent, and it refers to that spectrum, sort of an umbrella of operators that are non-traditional and non-incumbent. What that means is they do kind of prioritize local ownership, and they're sort of somehow accountable to their social or developmental mission. We categorize it, for sake to narrow it down to this report, we categorize them by the owner type to essentially 3 different types. And one is community owned. So you're probably familiar with the broad terminology that ISOC and APC have been using for many years now, which is community networks. But we're actually extending CCP definition beyond that. So there also include publicly owned networks like Muni networks, which are increasingly common in the United States, and we're hoping more so in developing markets. And then also there's a big, broad tent of private operators that do care about social purpose. And kind of that segment of operators we refer to as social enterprises. Again, the emphasis is here to retain value within the local community and to deliver broadband to primarily underserved urban, rural, or remote communities. I want to talk about 3 big takeaways today. I'd dive into the first one straight away, which is that CCPs that leverage community assets and resources to lower the cost of their development have a higher chance to actually be sustainable. The big lever for financial sustainability is the ability to decrease or avoid your major costs. If you look at the center of the slide here, we've broken up what major cost categories are for any network operator. It's essentially on the front end, kind of your upfront CapEx, all of the hardware that goes into building the network. And then on the recurring operational side, you do have labor costs, which is a big chunk of it. You have your backhaul costs. You have license and spectrum fees if you're choosing to go on a regulated spectrum, and then you have your power and utility costs, and probably some rental or lease cost. Now, these 4 or 5 levers are really the same regardless of any type of operator. The unique advantage that CCPs have is an ability to either avoid or decrease one or many of these cost categories. How they do that is essentially by engaging local stakeholders, by leveraging community resources and community assets. What does that look like practically? We'll see a lot of examples of that from our 3 guest speakers today. But in many cases, it's either donations in the form of volunteer labor, or free backhaul, or subsidized backhaul, or donated equipment, or low-cost equipment that's open source. And in the case of municipal networks, it looks like building out on street furniture that the city or the municipality has access to. In many cases, it just implies simply using unlicensed spectrum or benefiting from members of the community that grant access to their property as right-of-way. There are many different forms this can take depending on local context, and we're hopeful that the report illustrates many of them. The second one is that the capital structure and funding mechanisms really change based on both stage and the choice of owner-operator model. When we say stage, it's essentially financial feasibility. Can you cover your cost base? Are you at an operating loss, at a break even, or are you cash flow positive? That really changes the different mechanisms you have access to. On the ownership side, there's 2 types really. There's the ownership by type. So there's community networks, municipal, or social enterprise. Which one are you? Kind of automatically gravitates you to a specific direction. And there's ownership by legal structure. So if you're registered as a co-op, if you're registered as a company, if you're registered as a community benefit society, that has a unique implication also to the kind of finance you can attract. On the operating model side, it really depends on which stack of the network architecture you decide to participate in. So are you building only the physical layer of the network? Are you involved in the active deployment? Are you involved in customer service? All of that also has an impact on operational complexity and capital availability. We're also seeing what are called meso organizations develop, and we're excited about this, where a community network is essentially grown to the point where they're helping other community networks seed. And Zenzeleni is a perfect example of this. So we'll explore how stage and structure really affect availability. But you can see on this slide also that different types of CCPs have access to different types of financial investors. The third pathway is really about the spectrum of financing options. Financing CCPs is really a pathway from really high risk initially to a long-term yield in sort of the long term. Operators need to evaluate the trade-offs between different kinds of financing. Specifically, they need to look at the rate of growth that is required from them to justify an investment from a financial investor. This report is really focused on moving beyond that grant-supported bucket that you can see labeled A. So it's trying to get past classic philanthropy, which is focused on complete capital loss or even partial capital preservation, to this new paradigm of impact investing, which is about concessionary returns. And eventually, our goal is to migrate some or all of CCP operators to be able to access the large buckets of traditional financing. We know that's a long journey, and we know that maybe not everyone will get there. And in the interim, this report is really focused on matching financing sources with appropriate projects that are likely to have access to long-term sustained funding. We will talk more about, you will see why we're passionate about allocating more capital to CCPs, but I will highlight that they primarily operate in unserved and underserved communities. They're very deliberate in their intention of addressing market failures or opening up new markets. And they've demonstrated sort of viable, alternative, and low-cost strategies to be able to connect people that have been so far unconnected. Importantly, they do keep profits local and retain value within the community, create local employment, and support local self-reliance. With that, I do want to talk about the different panels we have today. These are structured in the way the report is structured, so they should give you a glimpse into different sections of the report. And we have a wonderful set of speakers today. And to kick this discussion off, I will pass it on to Jane Coffin and Bruce Patterson. Over to you, Jane, to talk about the role and development of CCPs.
Thank you, Anoop and Ben, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and an even greater pleasure to introduce Bruce Patterson to you. We're going to talk about why CCPs are uniquely suitable for connecting underserved communities. And Bruce has great experience with this. He's a recognized thought leader behind the AM Idaho model, which includes automated open access and a business model that mitigates risk for cities and creates local network ownership of infrastructure that is treated as a true public utility. For 15 years, Bruce was the technology director at the city of Ammon and was responsible for network planning, design, construction, and network operations. Bruce is widely recognized as the key influencer at the city for the project's success. I know Bruce knows a lot about construction too, and Bruce is currently the director of EntryPoint Solution Services, overseeing all consulting projects, including network planning, feasibility analysis, network design, cost projections, and much more. And I will simply also say we work very closely with Bruce, and he's a pleasure to work with as both an expert and a human being. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of why we know that CCPs are uniquely suitable for connecting underserved and unserved communities. And then Bruce and I are going to have Q&A, and it's really the part that I want to get to quickly. So I'm going to leave you with 3 things to think about. The financial feasibility of CCPs are largely determined by the degree to which they can avoid or decrease costs of building and operating a network. Anoop and Ben gave you a high-level overview for that. And CCPs also engage local stakeholders and leverage the community resources to lower the cost of deployments and have a higher chance of sustainability. Many of us have seen this as we've worked with local communities. I often will say it's the human nets that build the nets, and that it's a local issue where you really need that local sustainability. And many here today have been working on CCPs, community nets, muni nets around the world, and know how important it is to have that local buy-in. CCPs also must have an enabling regulatory and policy environment, particularly in certain countries where there are less developed regulatory and policy markets. Some have a better chance of making it when there's less stringent rules in place, but it's also an important thing that you've got to work with your community, whether it's the local government, the local tribal community, or others, so that you've got local buy-in. So I'm going to get right to it here with Bruce. Bruce, the first question I have for you is about 2-part question. So what is the place of public broadband infrastructure in the connectivity ecosystem? And what was the goal when you were starting the Ammon Idaho fiber network? Over to you.
Thank you, Jane. I appreciate that. I feel like you softened me up with that very kind introduction, but then you asked me a really hard question, and you realize it's about 8 a.m. here. So let me see how I can do. Let's start with the first one. Let's start with what's the place of public broadband infrastructure in the connectivity ecosystem? That's a very challenging question, and I think we're trying to figure that out in local areas. Many local cities, counties, we're working with a number of them, are trying to figure that out. What is their place? I would say this. From our perspective, the place is for that public owner to be the neutral host of the infrastructure, and open up that infrastructure and apply public financing mechanisms to the infrastructure. We feel like that provides some benefit to the end consumer, both in cost and in trying to drive access to everyone and make it affordable to everyone. We feel like those are key things that we're trying to deal with now as Jochai pointed out at the beginning, go to the places that are currently unserved and are going to be more challenging. So one of the key things that we can do by doing that is we can start to treat this infrastructure as a 50-year investment compared to a shorter term investment. We know that with the advent of fiber and some of the investments we're making, they're a lot higher cost. We're digging in the ground, we're installing cables, we're trying to make it more resilient. We're trying to avoid things that are subject to weather or fire and make it more resilient. So the costs are higher. So it makes much more sense to spread out that amortization and the way we pay it back over longer time periods and treat it more like we treat power projects to construct power facilities, electric facilities, or water or sewer. And it's been a unique experience to work with financial partners to try and shift their perspective, to get them to see it that way, because as they work with some of the traditional operators, particularly like wireless operators and so forth, the cycles are much, much shorter and the risks are higher. And so they do want to compress the time frame and make shorter term loans, higher yields. So we do have to work at proving that this infrastructure is 50-year infrastructure, which means we need to build it a little bit differently than we might have traditionally. In AM, that meant for us, we applied more of a data center type of architecture to it, rather than just a single ISP architecture. And that allowed us to do a bunch of different things on the infrastructure. And that actually helped us too to push down the cost for the consumer for internet, because it's supporting other public safety, city functions, educational functions, and so forth that contribute to the operation and the amortization of the network. So fundamentally, that's what I would say. And that was the goal when we started Ammon's network, was to prove that it was a good long-term investment. So that was actually one of the goals we had. And we feel like we've made some progress at that, but there's a lot of work to be done in public policy and a lot of work to be done in this area that you're focused on with the financial partners. And so we're really encouraged by this report.
Thank you very much, Bruce. I really appreciate the fact that you drew the distinction between the data center infrastructure type model. I think that's important for some colleagues in other countries to think about sort of a different structural modeling and how that might work with different services. So Bruce, another question for you. What were the critical competitive advantages in building out the Ammon Muni network? And I'm going to speak slowly because I've seen in the chat that there are colleagues who would like us to slow down a little, not you and me necessarily, but just to be mindful of that. So what were the critical competitive advantages in building out the Ammon Muni network? And how were you able to come in at a cost much lower than other networks, that cost component that's so important for build out?
So there were a couple of things we did. I think I'd focus on the first and most important one, which was separating the infrastructure from the services. You know, historically, as we built out this infrastructure, the service was bundled with it. But truthfully, if we build the right infrastructure, we can support a number of services. I alluded to that previously. And so one of the key aspects I feel like we were successful at doing in Ammon, it was a lot of hard work, it truthfully was to create a true, free, and open digital marketplace for services. And that really required unbundling technically the infrastructure from the services, but also economically, meaning that each of the partners or each of the providers that play a role in the ecosystem actually get their cost support for whatever they're delivering to the ecosystem separately. So it isn't a matter of one partner paying another partner. Every partner, so the city gets paid directly for the infrastructure, and that allowed us to unbundle and separate the service costs, which allowed a true marketplace where they actually competed with each other rather than worrying about what the price was for the incumbent operator in the area. So that I feel like was a really critical aspect. It's the only way you can really get out of that cartel style pricing that tends to result when you're doing facilities competition. So that was one aspect that really was a competitive advantage. The other thing is that the city of Ammon was already doing utility services, and we had frameworks that we could apply towards the build out of the infrastructure. And so we very carefully applied those frameworks to the infrastructure only, not to the service. And that allowed us to use some mechanisms to create a project, finance a project, and execute on it using public bond process, which is significantly different than a commercial loan that an enterprise or a commercial entity would take on. And so I think that helped us to push down the monthly cost that the consumer actually pays. So that was a competitive thing. And we'll talk about this, I think, a little bit more when we get into the LID process. But the other thing we did was we actually identified take rate up front. It's really common for operators. That's one of the biggest challenges is if you pass 10 homes, if only 5 connect, that's a different economic model than if 3 connect or 7 connect. And so what we did was we went out and did a pre-sign up, basically effectively figured out what the take rate was. And that allowed us to do all of our financial modeling and know what our minimum take rate would be and model onto that. And that's really effectively what a lot of the operators do, even commercially. But as we did that, what we found is our initial take rate was actually 50% for most all of the projects we've executed on, which is very, very high. And it allows you to take that risk out of the curve, as it were. So that was very, very helpful for us.
Thank you very much, Bruce. And I think for a lot of folks in other countries, that take rate aspect is really critical. As Bruce is saying, it helps de-risk some of the project build and the local governance modeling. There's more faith in how the project might move forward. And that's important with that trust building at the governance level with local partners. Question number 3 for you, Bruce. What is a local improvement district? Some folks on the call here from around the planet may not know. And what was the financial innovation pursued by the Ammon model?
I think one of the things that's very interesting is you talk to the general public, and sometimes even when you talk to somebody that's in the financial markets, they don't clearly understand for a public entity within the US, they can't just go out and sign a loan, for example, on an automobile for 5 years. They're precluded by law from doing that. So they either buy it up front or they engage in what would be a government approved lease, which ties back to an annual appropriations, meaning that the elected board for any public entity has an annual budget. They vote and they approve it. It's a very public process. Therefore, engaging in loans that are 5-year or 10-year that don't fall within that ability to approve the payments annually, they can't do that. So it's really important to understand that public entities within the US have very strict rules about how they borrow money, which is why we have things like public leases and we have things like public bonds. It's the mechanisms that they use to authorize long-term amortization and kind of give a financial lender or an investor comfort that they're going to receive their payments on a regular basis and recover the capital they need to at the interest rate they're asking for. So you have to use those frameworks. So an LID is one of those tools in the toolbox that a public entity can use in Idaho. Now, most all states have a similar tool. They might not call it a local improvement district. They might call it a special assessment district or an assessment district or something along those lines, but they really all work the same. The idea is that the public entity, through a very public process, creates a separate legal entity that has the authority to create a project and borrow money, then execute on the project. In other words, build the infrastructure out, whatever that is. And at the end, they close the project, they look at what has been spent, and through legal mechanisms, they have a way to go back to everybody that benefits from that project and apply an assessment to their property, because it should benefit their property and, in fact, increase their property value. So that's kind of the rationale behind it. That's what a local improvement district is. Ammon used it because it was the clearest and simplest tool to achieve the financing mechanisms that were necessary. And in Idaho and in most other states, there's an option to run them as an opt-in or an opt-out, meaning that a property owner that's within the area to receive the benefit can say, yes, I want it, or no, I don't. And so Ammon ran and continues to run all of its fiber improvements as an optional improvement districts. We announced to the neighborhoods we're going to build fiber and that it's viable when we achieve a certain take rate. We then collect or aggregate that demand until we hit the take rate that's necessary to make it economically viable. Then we execute on the project, move forward, and then at the conclusion of the project, we get a long-term municipal bond. I keep saying Ammon. I was there 17 years. I actually am at EntryPoint, been here for a year now, and we're helping to implement similar models for counties and cities across the U.S. at EntryPoint.
Thank you very much, Bruce, for that answer. And it's really helpful for folks to also know that there's a case study in the report about the AM Idaho model where Anoop and Ben and others had done a great interview and boiled it down into a case study. So you can see in the report toward the end in the annexes, these great case studies that the team has put together. Bruce, one more question. We have about 2 minutes left in this segment. So my final question for you is, how do we encourage more municipal networks, or known as munis, in the United States, especially in the context of emerging markets? So that municipal model that you were so instrumental in AM Idaho.
That's an excellent question. I think I'm going to divide it into two quick answers. In the US, I don't know that the munis need any more encouragement. What they need is partners. Partners that understand their ability to borrow money, how they do it, and partners that they're willing to look at the risks associated with the infrastructure and start to work with the muni to make it a 50-year investment. So they're comfortable with longer terms on the amortization, lower yields. The backstop is commonly the value of the municipality that it has in its bank, or it could be revenue that the municipality achieves through its regular processes, or it could be the property values that backstop it, like in the case of an LID. It's actually the property value that backstops the loan. For those in emerging markets, I would say this: it makes the most sense to use very public financing mechanisms, because if we're about the public good, we need to push down the cost, the monthly cost, for the end user. And in order to do that and get access everywhere, make it affordable, we've got to think about those high costs that are associated with building these things and use the best possible financing mechanisms, which are typically public projects.
Thank you very much, Bruce. And we're wrapping up this session. If you've just joined us, this was a session on why CCPs, or community connectivity providers, are uniquely suitable for connecting underserved communities. And we've just had an excellent Q&A with our colleague Bruce Patterson from EntryPoint, who is instrumental in building out an open access model network in AM Idaho. The case study is at the back of the report, and I believe our colleague Callum has popped a link to that case study in the chat. It is now my great honor and pleasure to introduce Carlos Rey-Moreno to you and turn over to the next section of the report. Carlos, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jane, and thank you very much, everyone. Actually, when we started thinking about this report and planning this report, I think seeing this launch is a dream, and the quality of the report and the depth of the case studies and all the lessons that we've learned through the process, and like how the case studies have been documented and presented. So yeah, with that, I want to kick this part of the launch that is on the section of ownership and operating models. This section actually dives into the various parameters and trade-offs that operators consider when deciding on their ownership structure, the legal entity, their operating models. And one of the early decisions that a network needs to make is regarding its ownership structure and operating model, right? And that choice has a major impact into the concentration of ownership, into the regulatory requirements, into the tax implications, into the operational complexity and ease of fundraising, among many other factors, right? So this section actually analyzes a framework of different operating models along with the degrees of participation in the network architecture. And it provides different examples of CCPs that fit within each of those categories of the framework. With me discussing in this section, I have Shaun Pather. Shaun Pather is a professor and chair of the Department of Information System in the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences at the University of the Western Cape. He is an ICT for Development expert and National Research Foundation rated researcher who focuses on information society issues. Besides that, Shaun has been involved in both research and real-world interventions which seek to minimize digital inequality, including through delivering broadband solutions to marginalized communities. He has been involved in national and international advocacy for grassroots-based solutions to address the challenges of the rural digital divide. Besides all that, Shaun is the chairperson of the board of Zenzeleni Networks, non-for-profit company. Welcome, Shaun, and thank you very much for joining us. So maybe
this is an exceptionally long introduction.
apologies for that. But without further ado, can you maybe go and tell us a bit about how Zenzeleni balance the tension between its social objectives and its financial sustainability? Maybe telling us a bit more about what Zenzeleni is and does. Thank you.
Thanks, Carlos. I think first and foremost, it's important to understand the trajectory of Zenzeleni because currently Zenzeleni is registered as a not-for-profit company, and but its roots actually come out of research, which Carlos is very well associated with, around 2012-13 action research. So it has a long history in founding itself in a community. And through the initial research, there was continuous experimentation with financial, technical, and legal options over a few more years until in 2017, when a broadband network was first developed with funding through project funding. And with that was the founding of the not-for-profit company, Zenzeleni Not-for-Profit, which comprises its various founding members of different expertise, including the University of the Western Cape, APC Regulatory, Ellipsis Regulatory, etc. And in its founding documents, the company has very strong social objectives, and those social objectives are beyond just providing affordable connectivity, which is there, but it's about providing affordable connectivity that brings meaning to the lives of people. And so I think the company finds itself in that deeply rooted with those objectives. The tension, of course, comes about then in terms of how do we actually, or what was the difficulties in bringing ourselves to financial sustainability, yet matching those social objectives. The reality is the communities that Zenzeleni serves in South Africa and the Eastern Cape are people who live essentially, I forget the USD conversion, but with just a few hundred rands. And their levels of affordability are very low. So Zenzeleni, as a not-for-profit company, has had the tension of trying to provide service to these people, yet we've only been able to rely on project funding. And so some of the project funding initially allowed for some construction of the network and network services. But by and large, the problem Zenzeleni has experienced, and which is well documented in the report that's being launched today, is that the reliance on project funding has not enabled the organization to focus on the core business. So the one thing I think we've realized, Carlos, is that somehow we've got to separate the mandates. We've got to focus on getting the network business so that we can grow the network to a state of being able to derive an income that's enough to provide affordable services in a cross-subsidization way to poor people. So it is a tension between having social objectives and providing affordable connectivity. But over our years of experience, I think we finally have some kind of understanding of what the way forward might be to address it. But in summary, I think that the reliance on project funding to undertake project activities on its own will not allow us to achieve our mandate and social objectives.
Maybe just to add to that run to US dollar conversion, I mean, people in the rural Eastern Cape where Zenzeleni is providing its services lives below $1 a day. So actually providing affordable services while being financially sustainable in places that have been deemed unprofitable for many is indeed a challenge. Shaun, another question for you. Zenzeleni has chosen different organizational structures through the years and now operates a sort of meso organization. Can you explain a bit more the different tiers of the Zenzeleni model, and how can those community networks within that model have a scale, or what we have learned, or what Zenzeleni has learned about the scalability of those community networks?
Yeah, thanks, Carlos. So I think when Zenzeleni started, the idea was to found community in a very strongly oriented community-based ownership, with the idea that the community would take far more responsibility than we understand it is able to now. So over the years, from having this very strong ethos of having a community, and in the Zenzeleni example, it was a model of cooperatives that was formed to take local ownership. And in our case, the cooperatives are actually the ones who carry the license from the regulator to run and operate the network. But I think what we've learned over time is that rather, and we also, I think at the outset, envisaged that as time moved on in a kind of traditional incubation scenario, that you'd be able to release the local community to take care and manage as much as possible of the local network, not just the local network, but of the ecosystem that goes around it to ensure effective use. I think what we've realized over a period of time is that there are a number of tensions in the areas that we serve. So the rate of infrastructure, the lack of infrastructure, the lack of skills, the lack of resources, a number of realities that make that initial idea not possible. So where we are now, what we realize is probably more feasible in the Zenzeleni model is that there is at least this 2 tiers where we call the not-for-profit company the meso layer, or the coordinating layer. And at the local layer, we now have derived a 3-layered system of local ownership, where we've learned that instead of a kind of a big bang approach to community ownership, that community ownership can take place gradually, layer 1, 2, and 3. Where at layer 1, we envisage that we create groups of micro entrepreneurs in a community who would own and manage their own hotspot, and that those hotspots begin to serve their livelihoods. And those entrepreneurs, individually and or collectively, can graduate to a 2nd layer where they begin to put value-added services into their business model. And they can even graduate further where they can start reselling and taking care of a larger part of the local network system. So we believe in this gradual kind of introduction or graduation of local ownership. But given the complexities of all the other elements of the ecosystem, we do believe that the meso layer, which is the not-for-profit now, will continuously play a role, especially in terms of regulatory and other support, in managing and maintaining a backhaul that provides service to the local communities. Then, of course, inherent in all of that is this point I mentioned just now of the tension. Because people surviving on that less than $1 a day, who can then only afford currently the 25 Rand a month voucher to the average citizen, is a cross-subsidization effect. So the business has to become sustainable because, as I've mentioned, we cannot rely on project funding. So the business has to scale, and it has to scale to get sufficient clients that we can call, let's call them anchor clients, but really who are small business type clients who would at least bring a sustainable layer of income so that the NPC can grow its network business with those types of, let's say, non-citizen clients to a sufficient level where it can now provide the cross-subsidization to people. Because even the people that we serve, that 30 Rand, South African Rands, which is just under $2, is not affordable. So we have to, in a sense, cross-subsidize. And this is the role of the meso layer as we see it.
Thank you very much, Shaun, for that. You were talking about the cross-subsidization from both projects and anchor clients to actually make affordable the connectivity to those that those users that use that monthly rate under $2 a month in the hotspots. What other financial tools and instruments has Zenzeleni relied on over the years, or can you maybe go a bit deeper into the different financial sources? I believe there has been some support from a public agency, for instance, to document the model. Can maybe you go a bit more in depth into that, as well as what is the path for the future, both for the self-generated revenue as well as potentially, the discussions with public agencies, as Bruce was mentioning, to support the work that Zenzeleni is doing.
Okay. I'm going to kind of go backwards with the answer. In the South African system, and as in many other countries, in actual fact, public policy does cater for a Zenzeleni, or does cater for the kind of community-based service we are providing to deal with underserved areas. And in this country, that is catered for in our Electronic Communications Act in Chapter 14, which is called the Universal Service and Access Fund. Regretfully, Zenzeleni, which in my view is most deserving of something like that, has not even seen a single cent of that fund, which would have put us in a very different place today in terms of our scale and growth had we had access to that fund. But that's a different debate. So in the main, Zenzeleni has relied on various sources of funding, project funding, to keep itself going. So whilst it's been running projects of various types, capacity building projects, computer labs and the like, and things, it's been using those funds to keep itself going, to try and continue with keeping the network business going. We've received funding from a number of organizations, so like Mozilla Foundation initially, APC and others. We've also have received funding from the South African government, though not from the Universal Service Fund, but that was to help support us to understand, document, and grow the model. So that was through the Department of Science Innovation, Technology Innovation Agency. But all of these funds are for project-specific activities. So the organization is running its network and undertaking those types of project activities, which as we now, as the board and as the MISO level, have decided that we will give very concerted effort and delineate the work of the network business so that can grow. And in terms of how we finance that, well, the idea is somehow or the other, we've got to finance to bridge, because it's a catch-22. We need to get to a sufficient level of scale of so-called anchor clients, or call it non-citizen clients, to get sufficient income to grow and expand to more communities to provide under 30 rands a month access. So our business model, our financial understanding going forward is about scaling the network business, and at the same time that the project activity can continue in parallel, but only insofar as project income will fund project activities. But we've got to scale the network business. I hope that's making sense.
Yeah, it is. It is. So maybe for the last couple of minutes of this section, briefly, one question, because when we were preparing this, we were talking about it, right? There are a lot of value on having been incorporated, the NPC, the non-for-profit company, as a membership-based organization, but also it has some caveats, no, some cons. Can you please maybe tell us a bit the pros and the cons of that decision? I mean, through the 4 years of existence of that mesh organization arrangement.
Thanks, Carlos. So actually, I'm trying to get back to the early days, but the decision for a not-for-profit company was, number one, we did believe in the notion of not wanting to make a profit. We believed in the notion of being an entity to drive, to be community-based, and so the not-for-profit kind of came up. So in an ideological sense, it served the interest of the founding members. And of course, then it also, the not-for-profit kind of gave, not direct ownership, no equity and the like of the founding members. So it addressed those ideological matters for us, and that was part of the pros. The other pro is as a not-for-profit, we are able to get certain tax exemptions and the like. And I do think as a not-for-profit, we do appear to be more appealing to people who support Zenzeleni, support the cause of Zenzeleni, and who now in the past and in the future would continue to lend support to us. So those are all some of the pluses. The minuses, of course, are, for example, I think the difficulty in attracting investors who don't want to invest in a not-for-profit, who might want to take some equity to kind of get some return going forward. I'm trying to think what might have been the other negatives of our model that I'm slipping my mind. Maybe just prompt me a little bit. But as we stand right now with the years of experience we have, I still think having created a not-for-profit model is been the right thing to do in this space. Because as I see the policy landscape in the country shifting and evolving, largely I think also out of the advocacy work Zenzeleni has been doing with APC and others, that there is going to be a role for not-for-profits being recognized in the regulatory landscape. So I think those are the pluses for me, and that it is, retrospectively, I still believe it's the correct decision we made.
Thank you very much, Shaun. And yes, actually, there was a surprising draft policy that was released on the 8th of September that contains an entire section on community networks and creating an enabling environment for community networks. We will see what it is, but it's from the government, and it looks like all those years of advocacy may result into some of those barriers being addressed for the likes of those MES organizations that actually try to mentor, try to support, try to share backhaul services and upstream internet services with a number of users and a number of other ISPs even within the network, train them, buy bulk equipment and the like, and the synergies of wholesale for an entire ecosystem that goes beyond one single ISP, right? And I believe that's one of the biggest elements when you also want to try to reduce the cost and provide affordable services into rural areas where disposable income is indeed an issue in Africa and in South Africa, or rural South Africa in this case. Anyway, thank you very much, Shaun. As Jane was saying, there is a case study in the annexes of the report about Zenzeleni. This section was about section 3 of the report on ownership and operating models. Beyond these type of models, it talks and it takes you through the framework of many other ownership and operating models. And I hope it was useful. Thank you very much, Shaun.
Can I just 60 seconds to make a comment? I just Carlos, just despite the lack of funding from the Universal Service Fund, etc., Zenzeleni has survived. It is existing. It has a future. We've just conducted an independent evaluation with the funding from Department of Science and Innovation, which provides empirical evidence that Zenzeleni has made a difference in the lives of the community it serves. And I just want to acknowledge here on this platform the thanks and support for many of the stakeholders, including APC, that has made Zenzeleni possible. Thank you very much, and to the stakeholders around the table here today.
Thank you very much, Shaun. Thank you very much for that reminder indeed. Ben, it's a pleasure to pass the microphone to you and to continue this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carlos, and thank you all for joining us and sticking with us. We're going to cover section 4 of the report, which is about financing mechanisms. And our goal here is really to go, one of the big takeaways of the report is to understand that financing mechanisms change through each life cycle of a community connectivity provider. And what does that evolution actually look like? So we have the tremendous honor of introducing Chris Conder with B4RN. B4RN is broadband for the rural north. And we're going to walk through B4RN, what has been their journey? What's been their journey from the early years to over the past decade to currently? How have they raised capital, seeded capital, built a network over that time? Now, as a quick introduction to Chris, Chris has lived in the Lune Valley in Lancashire in the English countryside for many years. In 2002, almost 2 decades ago, she began campaigning for rural broadband, and in the early years helped establish a wireless network around her village. That was the rural village of Rey, that was supplied by satellite network. Now that is transferred over to fiber. To give you all a sense of B4RN in terms of by the numbers, this is over 20,000 homes passed, 11,000 customers. There's 5,000 kilometers of fiber that have been laid. And one of the things that we always find incredibly interesting is there's over 3,000 shareholders that are part owners in this community network. Chris has been a true pioneer in self-installation of fiber, everything from DIY fusing, but not only how that works, but then training a community of volunteers. Many of those folks have gone on from training to now work for Barn. So we are incredibly excited to welcome Chris here. And let me start off with a pretty basic question. Let's go back to the early years. How did Barn get off the ground initially and finance that initial phase of growth in those early years?
Barn was, first of all, inspired by the community in the Lune Valley who built a wireless mesh network. So there was a wireless mesh network with help from the local university, and there was a satellite network as well for businesses. So because we knew we had a community that was interested in getting connected, we then approached a chap called Barry Ford, who was the real genius behind Barn and a network planner. And we came up with this plan to access funding, which was available at the time through the Agriculture Board here, DEFRA, and it was £750,000. So we built a project, a business plan based on spending £750,000 to get what we classed as a digital parish pump, which was a fibre feed to 7 or 8 different villages in the valley. That was our plan. And it was a really good plan. And in the process, we picked up champions and volunteers from all those villages. So we had a management team. That management team comprised of retired doctors, retired accountants, retired solicitors, all sorts of different people representing the community. So we had a massive skill set in our management team, which all fed into the plans, which Barry then converted into the business plan, which went forward to get this funding. We had this funding, but at the last minute it was taken off us by the Northwest Development Agency and given to our local council, who gave it to the incumbent. The incumbent just wanted to do fibre to the cabinet, through fibre through the broadband, through the phone lines. And we were just totally horrified and disgusted, having done 2 or 3 years of really serious work and research and inspiring the communities and talking to the communities. And so we just said, well, seeing as how we've done all this work, we've got this business plan, we know the communities want it, why don't we borrow some money from a bank or something? So we asked at the banks, and none of the banks would give us any money. The government wouldn't give us any money, even though they got money earmarked for rural areas like ours with the DEFRA plan and everything. They wouldn't give us any money. So we said, right, let's go to the people. We know the people want it because we've met them all at the parish meetings. We know they want it. Let's go to the people and ask them for the money. Well, you can't do things like that. You've got to be a business and you've got to register as a business with the Financial Services Authority. And you've got to do this and you've got to, well, let's do all that. Okay, well, we'll do all that. So we did all that, and we're all volunteers. So we were all flying by the seat of our pants, and we went to the people and we said, right, can you raise £200,000? And if you can, we'll buy all the duct and then we'll give it you back and you can dig it all into the ground with your tractors and your mulch plows. And the people just rallied to the cause, and we raised £300,000 by the deadline, which was 3 months later. We had raised, in 3 months, we'd raised £300,000, and our budget for the 8 parishes was 1.3 million. And we were confident that once we started digging, all the other people in the communities who thought, oh, they're a pile of nutters, this isn't going to happen, would then buy shares. So that the model that financed Juan originally was everybody who wanted it bought shares. The shares were valued at £1. The shares would not go up or down in value. And the only help we had from the government in the first 5 or 10 years was the fact that anybody who was a taxpayer who bought shares got 30% tax relief on those shares. And that was a big investment. That was a big thing to make people who were fairly wealthy invest, buy more shares than they needed, and that helped a poorer person. So, you know, because the interest rate was good as well, we pay 5% interest on our shares. That's another way of paying money back into the community. I'll have to keep stopping and you'll have to ask me another question. Otherwise, we'll still be here tomorrow.
No, thank you very much, Chris, for that introduction. I think, you know, there's a lot of people in the audience, I'm sure, who are in that near-death experience of feeling like, will our organization last? And seeing how Barn has been able to push through, and now a decade and a half later, have the size that you have. I know that's an inspiration to a lot of folks who are here. And I want to dig into that. I want to dig into, so that there's that first period of using the shareholder mechanism, and people got that tax benefit. Walk us through the next phase of growth and how you began to receive both a combination of equity funding, potentially a bit of grants, and then how that led to the government voucher scheme and how you were able to work with the government to influence that government voucher scheme. And then maybe explain a little bit of the trade-offs between those. Were they good? Were they bad? Was there anything else you would do differently?
Well, once we got going and we proved that we could light up our own fibre, and we did it at a gigabit symmetrical. So it's the fastest, it was at the time, it was faster than NASA. So we are the fastest network in the world. We can now do 10 gigabit. I've actually tested it at my farm. I can get 10 gig at my farm. So we started building this network, and it was at one end of the 8 parishes, and they just went hell for leather up the mountain, digging all this duct in and spending all the money that we'd all raised together. So we'd another group of people at the other end saying, well, when are we going to get digging here? So they got digging and they started. So then we needed some more money. Luckily, more people bought shares. So we literally were living from hand to mouth. If we wanted fibre, we couldn't buy duct. So we had some really good suppliers who looked after us and gave us 90 days credit. It was that tight in the early days. But because one village got it in our 8 that were in a cluster, everybody around that village in other villages then decided they wanted it and put money in, and they wanted duct. So it was like a spider's web. It just started growing and growing and expanding and expanding. And we needed more money to buy more duct, to buy more fibre, to give to them, to build it with. So one of our directors approached the Esme Fairbairn Foundation, and they lent us some money. We had to pay it back, of course, but they lent us some money. And then she said, we still need some more money. We need to buy more fibre. We need to buy more cabinets. And we were still all volunteers at this point. Nobody was getting paid. And she came up with this legal scheme where people could loan us money. So they could become shareholders, which is a big risk, but it's less of a risk to loan a company money. So the community started loaning us money on 1, 3, 5 or 10-year loans. And the legal people in the committee made sure everything was done legally. And that kept us going for another few years. And then once we reached 600 customers, we could pay our way, with our backhaul. And so we took on our first employee, who was Alistair, and he was somebody who came to help us digging and fusing, and then became our first barn fuser. So he was the first person Then when we got to 1,000 people, Prince Charles came and lit the 1,000 fibre for us. And we could employ a secretary. So it meant Barry was freed up to do more network design and planning instead of paying all the bills. So with 2 members of staff. And then about the 1,000 mark, that's when it exploded and lots of people came live at one time. That's when we got more and more staff. Then the EIS scheme, which was the tax-free scheme, stopped and investment dropped then. The shares dropped because rich people could no longer get tax relief. So we kept on with the buy £1,500 worth of shares and you will get a free connection. So your connection was free. Your service you paid for, but the actual connection was free. That brought another load of shares in. And then we started ring fencing shares so that the shares one village bought could only be used in that village to stop another village taking all the money for fibre and duct. And that worked and that brought more money in. And then the voucher scheme started. Now, the voucher scheme from BD UK, the government, is a very good scheme, but it is very, very difficult to access. So because we already had money and customers and an income and a network, we could afford to connect a person on a voucher. The community could connect that customer, and once that customer goes live, you can draw down your voucher money. But it's no good for a startup company because you've no money to get the customer live in order to claim the voucher. So it has its drawbacks. It also means we need 2 members of staff employed solely to administer the vouchers, because naturally enough, if it's public money, the civil servants can't go shelling out vouchers like the sweeties. They have to be accountable. And so it is a very complicated process to get vouchers. It's not easy. No government money is easy. But what I think, this is all my opinion, this isn't Barnes' opinion, I'm just a volunteer. But what I think should happen is the government should figure out a way of enabling the people to do this sort of stuff, because it's the community input that keeps our price so low. I mean, there's nowhere else in the world I don't think you can get what we deliver, a gigabit symmetrical, with all the backup and support that people get for £33 a month. It's just so good and so cheap. And the community ownership means because we own the company ourselves, we the people, Barn don't own the company. We, the people, own our company and we look after it. So if we see a digger going up that field and we know our ducks in that field, we'll go and tell that digger man that to be careful there because our duck's there, and we look after our network. So, and all our network is buried. We don't use any poles. It's all got to be underground. So it's all safe, because we also see it, like the other chap was saying, 50, 100-year investment, this. In the infrastructure. The infrastructure is our asset. And I've forgotten the question now.
No, that is extraordinarily helpful. Thank you. And I just want to let everyone know, this is a success 2 decades in the making. So please you'll see it on slide 114, goes into depth, explaining a little bit over time. Another point I just wanted to highlight is also there's page 105 of the report talks about that financial sustainability metric. And I think, Chris, you talked about that 600 customer mark when things started to change, being able to afford your own CapEx. Walk us through kind of that division of labor. What has always fascinated me about Barn is the division of labor between what the community does in terms of trenching and ducting and what you guys over time have had kind of more professionalization and kind of the technical skills. How has that evolved?
Yeah, well, it was really interesting in the early days, because if you had a spade or a digger or a mole plough, you could put our duct in and we paid you £1.50 a metre in shares. That's how we paid the farmers for digging the ducting in. And then we insured those people. So if they dug through a water main or something, or hurt themselves or hurt somebody else, we insured them. Barn insured them as volunteers. But once you get into a more professional level, which was about the 2,000, 3,000 customer, we had to start thinking about ever so much more about health and safety, because more people were involved, and some of them you don't know how good they are, how bad they are. So health and safety and human resources does come into play, and all that costs money. To become more professional, you've got to have more money. So nowadays, most of all our digging is done by professional contractors, and now I think they're paid £2 or £2.50 a metre. It's still way below industry standards, but because it's through farmland, it's easy work. So some days they can make a lot of money, and some days they have really bad days where they're going in a gully and they've a fence and a wall and all sorts of problems to overcome, and they won't make very much money, but they're very good contractors and they take it on the chin and they get on with it. We also used to let people install their own houses, but we found it does cause a lot of problems, and our new CPE is so small and so delicate, they're breaking the fibre inside it, and so we found it's easier to pay contractors to do it. And what we do is we find local contractors in each area. So we're spread on a massive to us. It's small compared to America and Canada, but to us, we cover a massive area. It takes 4 hours to drive from one end to the other of our network, and our remotest bit is 6 hours away. So to us, it's big now, but we try to have local people in every area doing all the different jobs. So, for example, we had one lady whose UPS had failed, and we advise all the elderly people on free phone lines, the VoIP phone lines, to get a UPS. And no matter what we said to her over the phone, we couldn't ascertain what the problem was. So I said, well, it's not a problem. I'll get Martin to go around. So I rang Martin, who's the local champion. Oh, I know her, he says. I'll go around and sort it out. And that's the strength of a community network. Everybody knows everybody. Each area is subdivided into little ones with a champion, with volunteers. If there's a problem, the local people will sort a little problem. I mean, big problems. If it's cut fibre, we have teams and they're out there within an hour fixing it. If it's a big break, well within the hour, the break has been found to the nearest metre, and the teams are on the road to it and get it mended. So even big 288 fibre strikes where the fibre's cut right through, it's mended within 24 hours. Even if we have to send 2 teams, we'll send them. And they're just amazing. Our staff are absolutely awesome. And they're all recruited from locals, if you will. They're all local people and really dedicated. And the local volunteers, who were the ones who go around checking on people's fittings and making sure it's all done properly, they stay loyal to us too, because the shareholders, they own us. They are the company. And I've forgotten the question again.
No, thank you so much, Chris, for that context. And it illustrates a big point that we tried to get into the report, which is there is different stages. We talk about stage 1, starting, then sustaining, then growing. And there's certain things that change in each of those stages, division of labor, financing, et cetera. But the one common thread that doesn't change is that idea of community ownership, people feeling like this is theirs and this is theirs.
The thing with the funding, that I got the question and then I forgot to answer it. The next big jump in funding was when we borrowed £3 million from the Triadus Bank. It's like a crowdfunding bank, isn't it? Triadus Bank, cooperative type bank. So we borrowed the £3 million in order to build out, to get the vouchers. Do you get what you do? You borrow the money. You can only borrow the money when you've already got money and assets. Otherwise, you can't get the money. So you borrow the money so that you can then harvest all the vouchers, because the vouchers are available for your area. So you borrow the money, you buy more equipment, you take on more staff so that you can connect more people and get more vouchers and help more people. And that was agreed upon by our shareholders. We could either sit tight and start to make money and give it back to the communities, because that's in our rules, we can't keep it, or we could keep on helping more people. The shareholders voted to help more people. So you borrow the money so that you can get more vouchers. Immediately you borrowed the money and spent the money on staff and vehicles and equipment. The government pulls the plug on the vouchers because they say, oh, we've got to go into procurement now because the incumbent wants to do these areas. Now, in a year's time, the incumbent will decide, oh, it can't actually do those areas. But you've had staff, investment, and everything ready for a year. Now, luckily, our directors and our managers are quite smart, and they had already harvested enough areas to keep us in work for a year or two. So we're okay, and we'll be able to pay. Well, I think we have paid. I don't know if we have or not. I'm not involved in that. But you can pay your loan back. But so another business could be tricked that way. And I think that is another thing. It's a government failing not to realise the danger that the incumbent is to rural community startups. And if they're not prepared to do these areas, they shouldn't really be allowed to interfere with what government's decided to do, to give vouchers to our rural areas. And the incumbent can just stop it just like that.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. I know that's very powerful for all of us. And thank you very much for time and the success that Barn has had over the years and for being so open and generous in sharing all of that information. Now, let me turn it back over to Juan, who's going to walk us through some of the recommendations and questions from the audience. Juan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Juan Peirano. I'm with the Internet Society. I'm a senior policy advisor. I had the honor and pleasure to be part of the steering committee working in this project and in this report. It was amazing. The amount of knowledge that I gathered from the people participating was very, very high. And I cannot wait to share this with our community at the Internet Society and others, because I shared already internally and everyone is very, very excited. So it's great to have this launch today. I'm going to go very quickly with an overview of the recommendations, because as Ben was mentioning at the beginning, we want people to nod their heads when they are reading this, so they are very clear and very actionable. And again, because of the target audience was or is government and policymakers, CCPs, so community providers and investors, we have three main areas of recommendations. First of all, for policymakers, very clear and very obvious, try to enable CCPs as much as possible. And we have been hearing stories about how can that happen, but I invite you all to read some of the recommendations to the report. Basically, spectrum, rights of way, unlocking universal service fund for CCPs, among others. Also establish procedures that are easy for CCPs to apply for a license, for to be legally established. So for CCPs, I think most of the recommendations are focused on being able to recognize the stage in which the CCP is in, so they can basically build a framework that fits their purpose of the community, so they can achieve that financial sustainability. So this is the main recommendation for every CCP, and not at the end of the report is just a recommendation, but throughout the report you can see examples and ways to achieve this. So I think, again, a very clear and actionable recommendation. And finally, for funders, in which ISOC fits in, it's how we use this report and how we try to establish ourselves in this ecosystem to unlock as much funding as possible. Again, depending on our strengths. Again, as an example, ISOC is on the grant stage, so very at the very beginning. So how we can enable as much funding for CCPs as possible, and how we can help grow them further and become more sustainable. So this is a very, very quick overview. I invite you all to read through this report. But what I wanted to do now is have a very quick fireside discussion with the panel and ask everyone that has been participating today a very quick question about the recommendations. And it will be basically It can be in the report or outside the report. And I would like to start with the community providers. If they have to pick one recommendation for the audience of what they should do, what would that recommendation be? And please let me start with Chris. Maybe one recommendation, one minute recommendation for the audience.
I would say just follow our thing, which is JFDI. Get the community involved. Use the skills of your community. Get a good committee together, a good management team together, and make a good plan, and then just go with it, and your people will support you. And I just hope the government will support you too to get started.
Yeah, perfect. Build it and they will come. Shaun, a recommendation for the audience?
Thank you. Sorry, thank you. I not a single recommendation, but I mean, the advice or I think the foremost lesson we've learned is that we cannot take the realities of on the ground for granted. That it needs a proper and thorough assessment and understanding of the nature of community ownership to ensure sustainability. That's the lesson I would offer. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Shaun. Bruce?
I think what I would say, and I think the report really develops this thought, is that we can't outsource the solution. We all have a voice in this that includes the communities, it includes the community partners, it includes financial institutions, it includes public policy. We've all got to come together. If we're going to bridge the gaps we have, it's going to take all of the stakeholders working together. And so my advice would be to the communities, recognize you have a voice, step forward and participate in the dialogue, start to shape your own outcomes. And you can do it if you participate. But if you sit back and wait, you're going to be a long time waiting.
Thank you very much, Bruce. And then very quickly, maybe to the funders, maybe Connect Humanity, Jochai, a 1 minute recommendation for the audience.
I think that there are often a lot of community assets that exist, from knowledge and skills to, legal structures and, potentially community contributing capital. And so I would start by really figuring out what your community needs are and looking at what assets you have and build from there in terms of, and know that there's a variety of different models to meet the needs of your community.
Thank you very much, Jochai. Carlos? 1 minute recommendation for the audience.
Thank you. I think is something about the resilience of the communities that are living in areas that are not, profitable or of interest of the main traditional providers, and how, in this case, at least on the rural areas of the global south, where APC was the most. CapEx, there is a need for some sort of a source of CapEx. Government is spending a lot of money into putting funds into private networks, people from urban areas, far from the realities, far from the interest, that when things don't work, they just leave. And there are a lot of examples, even in South Africa, where Zenzeleni works, did this happen, and the company filed for liquidation. So asking governments to pay more attention and to really see the evidence from this report and others that communities, no matter how rural they are, want to do it, can do it, and they will be supported if they start this journey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. And finally, from Connectivity Capital, Ben or Anoop? 1 minute.
Yeah, I think putting my financer hat on, I think one hope that we hope everyone takes away from this report is the concept that risk exists on a spectrum, and what you do over the life cycle of a CCP is about reducing risk. And the strategies that you take in the early days will evolve over time, and it opens a lot more doors to financing in the later years. So this idea of committing to a path of financial sustainability, but then realizing over time, you're reducing risk in the eyes of a financer as you grow, connect more users.
Thank you very much, Ben. And now we know that we have a bunch of questions from the audience, and we are almost at the top of the hour. I don't know, Callum, Deborah, if maybe we move forward to the closing remarks, and then we keep track of these questions, and we come back to you. Please reach out to any of us in the panel, because we are very, very interested in your questions. So maybe I just pass the mic back to Jochai for some final remarks and reflections. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you so much to all of our speakers and panelists today. This was a fascinating conversation. It's always so inspiring to hear these stories of communities coming together and building their own internet. And spoiler alert, the report is full of a series of other case studies of equally inspiring communities, which I encourage you to check out. I think it's clear that there's no one best model for how to meet community needs. And there is certainly not, there's a wide range of sustainable community connectivity provider models. Incumbent operators, the way telecom has traditionally been built, is not the only option. And similarly, there's a wide range of financial structures and sources of capital that can help to meet communities to meet their digital equity needs, even in very extremely low income communities and very remote communities. And while these economic and business models might not look like a traditional telecom, there are sustainable ways of supporting community connectivity providers, and these investments are not as risky as they appear. And so I would ask that you download the report and read it, and thank you. And please share this report with partners and allies. We really hope this will be a resource to communities themselves and community connectivity providers, to regulators and government policymakers, as well as to investors and financiers themselves. And finally, please do take a look at our website, connecthumanity.fund, as well as our other friends here presented today. All of our organizations produce a variety of materials and resources. And thank you, everyone, for all that you do to advance digital equity in the world. Enjoy the rest of your day, evening, wherever you may be.
Okay, bye.
Thank you so much, everyone.
I've answered the questions on the chat.
Thanks, everyone.